Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be reviewing Rebecca Roanhorse's Trail of Lightning. I had not heard of this book until a couple days ago when I found it on Scribd, and I was really intrigued by the blurb. The book is set in a kind of urban fantasy post-apocalyptic setting where the old gods are returning, but so are the old monsters. And so that's where the main character Maggie comes in. She's a monster hunter and she studied under this really legendary immortal who's called the Monster Slayer. I really appreciated the structure of this book because in the first chapter we see Maggie in her element as she's hunting a monster, and it ends on a really grim note, and the first chapter just does a really good job of setting the tone for the rest of the book. And so even though I would say the first third of this book, the plot takes a little time to get going, because the first chapter was so well written and so well paced and the action scenes were so good, I kind of didn't mind that the plot took a little time to get going after the first chapter, because I knew that Rebecca Roanhorse had something up her sleeve for the later half of the book. Something I really liked about this book was the fact that Rebecca Roanhorse's voice is very distinct in the genre. I don't think I've ever read a book that was quite like this, and it's always really fun to kind of discover a book that gives you a feeling you've never gotten before. Like, I have read urban fantasy. I read the first two Jim Butcher books and I just couldn't keep going. Like, the main character, Harry Dresden, was just like super smarmy and I just didn't like him. And like, I have read post-apocalyptic books like, you know, The Hunger Games, I guess counts. It's more dystopian. And like, I have read like 1984, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451. But again, those are all like dystopians, and I haven't read a ton of post-apocalyptic fiction, so maybe that was why I thought this book was so unique. But regardless, I do think that Roanhorse was a really strong writer, and that especially comes through in her action sequences. I'm one of those people who, like, when I'm watching a movie or reading a book, like, if there's an action sequence, like, it's very easy to lose me during an action sequence. I think part of the reason why I am not a huge fan of like Marvel and Star Wars is just because during the action scenes, I just check out. Like, my brain, I'm just thinking about what I want to eat after I get out of the movie. And same thing with books. Whenever I'm reading a really long, drawn out battle or something like that, I am just thinking about, like, I'm kind of just like skimming the words. I'm not really engaged. But I didn't feel that way with the action in this book. And I think that's really important because it is like a monster hunting book. You kind of have to like the action. And I think Roanhorse does a great job of balancing the detail and kind of going abstract with those sequences. Another thing that I think this book does really well is the world building. I think one of the biggest issues with fantasy is that authors create this really interesting world and they want readers to know all about it, but that can also feel very info dumpy and not very fun to read. But Rebecca Roanhorse does a great job of weaving details about the backstory and the lore of her world into the narrative, and doing it in a really organic way where all these little nuggets of information come up naturally in conversations between characters. And I just really appreciated how she respected the audience's intelligence to kind of pick up on these nuggets of information that she was dropping. The main character, Maggie, I mentioned before, is a monster hunter, and she's kind of a lone wolf, I work better alone type. And she has a really gruff exterior, but you can tell that on the inside she has been through a lot of trauma, and that trauma informs a lot of her characterization. It was really satisfying to see her arc of kind of opening up to people and letting people in. Which brings me to one of the supporting characters, whose name is Kai. He's introduced to her as a love interest, like literally his grandfather is like setting him up with Maggie. But their relationship really works for me because Kai takes Maggie seriously as a partner and as a friend, and I think that made their relationship very believable. I really liked how Kai respects Maggie's boundaries and he doesn't push her too far, but he still encourages her to kind of like step out of her comfort zone without being too pushy. And so yeah, I really love this book for how great its world building was, the great action sequences, and the relationships between all of the characters. And I do think that the plot takes a little time to get going, but once it does, there's a lot of really interesting plot developments. I wouldn't call them plot twists, you can kind of see them coming, but the book does go in some directions that I was not expecting, and I was really pleasantly surprised by that. I think it's between this book and like The Poppy War, which I read earlier this year, it makes me really optimistic for the future of fantasy, where we have people of all kinds of backgrounds coming together to tell their stories in a fantasy setting. There's more than enough room in this genre for more than just like old white folks telling their stories and kind of like making stuff up. I really appreciate fantasy that is grounded in reality and grounded in real culture. Fantasy is often kind of billed as an escapist genre, but I think my favorite fantasy is always the books that teach me something real about the real world. And yeah, I just really love this book, and I'm super excited to get into the sequel. I do think that the first book kind of ends on the first book does kind of end on a bit of a cliffhanger, and I am super curious to find out what happens next in Maggie's story, and yeah, I think Rebecca Roanhorse is definitely an author to keep an eye on. So thank you so much for watching. This is like my third or fourth book review, and I feel like I'm finally getting comfortable talking to the camera and speaking up and making my point coherent. And yeah, if you have any comments or suggestions, I would love to read them. And please leave a like and subscribe if you like this video, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.